everybody, welcome to the very first live episode, and any real episode of the Queer Agenda with On Canada Project and special co-host Fae Johnstone from Queer Momentum, as well as Wisdom to Action. We are so excited to be able to do this, and I'm just going to bring Fae on so that we can get it going, I guess. I'm sure it'll work. It'll be totally seamless technology.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Happy Pride.
Happy Pride. Okay, I'm so excited you're here. I think we last had you on.
It's been like a hot second, but like not that many hot seconds.
Yeah, like we haven't done a lot of lives, and you were one of our last lives before the politicians that came through. So so excited to have you back. This sort of came birthed out of the idea of like, how do we sustain a conversation after Pride, particularly as we face rising hate everywhere, but definitely for the trans community, as well as like the larger queer community. And I mean, like, when they come for some of us, they're coming for all of us, because we're not free until everybody's free. So we were texting back and forth, and we're like, what do we do? And we're like, cool, let's just take it to Instagram and see what we could do. So every month, the Queer Agenda will be back here. It'll also be available a week after it airs live on YouTube, or within a week. And it'll have Fae Johnstone here, and like a multitude of guests and activists and influencers, creators, leaders that are doing the important work and that can speak to the change that we want to see. Anything to add, Faye?
Just that I'm hyped. I think, we need, we got hate rising, we've got a lot of crises going on, and we need like a critically queer lens on the world. So I'm just like honored to be here and excited to do this every month.
Me too. I'm also super excited about our next guest, but before we say that, I'd like to remind folks that yes, it is called the Queer Agenda, but this is a discourse for everybody. It doesn't matter if you're part of the community or not. Allyship and solidarity is the only thing that can get us through the hot mess express we are living within right now. And yeah, so Faye, why don't you introduce our super exciting guest?
Awesome. So I love the human that we have coming on today. Her name is Debbie Owusu-Akyeeah, and I don't even know where to begin. I guess Debbie and I go way back. We used to work at a sex shop together in downtown Ottawa, selling all kinds of sexual health products and giving evidence-based advice on sex, sexuality, and healthy relationships. But she is now the executive director of the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity, one of Canada's leading queer and trans organizations that are doing incredible work to support young folks in schools and communities all across Canada. She is one of the most respected, phenomenal queer and trans advocates that this sector has going on. And I have never met anybody who can walk with the nuance in this work that she brings. And you can see her on your screen. Please give claps for the incredible Debbie.
Oh, thanks so much for the intro. Hi, everyone.
Hello. So excited to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Is there anything you want to add to your bio?
Oh, geez. Well, happy Pride, everyone. If there's anything I could add is that I am someone who loves policy. So if there's anything around policy, both foreign and public, I'm really interested in it. Even municipal. So I was really engaged with the Toronto election yesterday. But also, kind of reminding people that some of the most marginalized folks within TWIS LGBTQ communities have been talking about the issues we're facing right now with regards to rising hate. And so not to say we told you so, but that would probably be the lens that I would bring to this conversation today.
Oh, I love that so much. I'll say before we get started that I knew that I was going to be forever obsessed with Debbie when I saw her at a conference and everyone was talking around the issue, and Debbie was like, yeah, so it's like white supremacy. And I was like, oh my God, why is someone actually saying this? Like, how foreign is it to hear someone speak directly to the issues? Like, it still feels like scary to say it. And like, I can write it all the time, but I'm always still nervous to say the word out loud. So it's like such a tiny thing, but it really challenged me to show up better in naming the things. And it also just made you like infinitely cool in my eyes, which is probably not like that special, but it is in my internal monologue of life. Okay, so we're going to start by chatting about the rising hate. And the reason we're starting here is that OCP has tried to do a lot of work this month about highlighting the joy that is in the trans community and the queer community. We really wanted to not be all like trauma porny around it and like really like catastrophic around it. That being said, like it's not great out there, and it does feel necessary to sit and talk about the very real threat to human rights that is happening in Canada to the queer and trans community that is significantly amplified when you add in other intersectional identities that go along with that. So yeah, maybe we can just do a roundtable speaking to what you both have been seeing as, it's a very tiny roundtable, it's a triangle, speaking to what you guys have been seeing in like your work, because you both work very directly on this. Yeah, maybe we'll start with Fae, since Debbie just went.
Oh yeah. So absolutely, I feel like queer and trans communities for years, and particularly Black, Indigenous, and racialized queer and trans folks have been like sounding the alarm about the world not being where it needs to be writ large, and in particular about the devastating risk and now ongoing impact of rising hate. So to kind of like baseline some things, from 2020 to 2021, we saw a 64% increase in hate-motivated police-reported violence against queer and trans communities. And that is just the very tip of the iceberg. That only factors in those who are reporting, and we know that queer and trans communities are less likely, particularly when you add other intersections of race, of disability, of poverty, class, etc., are less likely to report to police. So we're seeing a rise in hate on that level from a pure like police reported violence lens. We are also seeing protests targeting drag story hours, drag events, schools, and queer and trans individuals and organizations from coast to coast to coast. I'm waking up every day to news stories about pride flags being burned, about folks experiencing hate online and in their own communities as they're going to the grocery store or just like living their best lives. And so I think a lot of folks imagine that we've come so far, this isn't like a problem in Canada. And we have like a naivete around the hate that we're already seeing. And that's a lot of what worries me right now, is that we're still not taking this hate seriously. So I'll leave it there, and maybe Debbie, I'll throw it to you to add your lens.
Yeah, so don't think it was mentioned, but I am the executive director of the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity, which is a national 2S LGBTQ organization that has a youth focus. And for almost 2 decades, you've been working in school communities across the country, delivering workshops and programming that talks about gender and sexual diversity. Over the recent years, especially when I joined, we've looked to expand our programming to center the experiences of queer and trans people who often aren't at the forefront. So we look to exploring things like intersectionality, power and privilege. These are all conversations that I had to wait to pay for a post-secondary degree to talk about in the classroom setting. But we're creating those opportunities for younger folks and for educators to be able to do so, to challenge curriculum. That's an institution that has historically caused harm to us LGBTQ people in kind of being that pathway that explained how we were supposed to behave as citizens in society, and that also included rigid gender roles, expectations around how genders would present, what work they were going to have, what type of sex they would have. And this kind of goes into one of the kind of pillars of our work, which is our comprehensive sexuality education programming. And our work is inspired by organizations like Action Canada for Sexual and Reproductive Rights, and CCAN, whose acronym I always forget, but they are at the forefront, kind of creating benchmarks around sex ed that's shared with everyone. And part of their messaging, which is kind of key to the advocacy that we speak to when we talk about education, queer and trans folks, and what's in the curricula, is that early intervention that addresses power is really key to creating the worlds that we want, where queer and trans young people don't have to face stigma for who they are, where young girls and young women, whether they're cis or they're trans, recognize how the patriarchy operates, and how we teach sex ed also teaches how we maintain power in intimate settings and relationships. And that intervention work is groundbreaking, and it's scientifically backed, it's backed by research, and we recognize how important it is, which is why we fight to make sure that those things are centered in schools. On the flip side, the far right also knows how important that early intervention work is, and they are in the business of maintaining power structures that uphold a white supremacist, cis, heterosexual patriarchy. And so our education work, the work that many progressive people, many progressive educators look to do, is in opposition to what some of these far-right groups, who haven't seen the level of popularity they have now for a very long time, it's been their cause. And they are really good at strategy and playing the long game. So when we think about groups like Campaign for Life or Parents as First Educators, and there's some other groups as well, Faye, I'm forgetting their names, they've been playing the long game for decades, where they've tried for a very long time to try to lobby provincial governments on what sex ed is being taught. And then these interesting watershed moments have happened. I live in the province of Ontario. For those who are here, it's the center of the universe. Just kidding. It's a very large province, but we're seeing now the ripple effects of similar conversations in other provinces like New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, Alberta, where when the provincial government was elected, one of the first things that they went to make sure their social conservative base was happy was the sex ed curriculum. And Faye, I think that's also some of the first time that I think we started engaging politically in the city, despite being colleagues, was around the response to that. And it was one of those moments where we saw that sex ed that, I was learning in the late 90s, early 2000s, they wanted to go back to because it didn't challenge power and it didn't challenge white supremacy, and it saw queer and trans folks normalized in a way that we haven't seen before. And now the long game that these folks have been playing, they're getting some big wins. And there's been multiple watershed moments. There's been the trucker convoy, for example, here in Ottawa, that showed what is possible when you mainstream what we've used to consider as kind of problematic views to have publicly. What we're now seeing is that those ideas, you can't have them publicly. You can't share those. Not only that, you might have the ear of politicians to inform public policy and possibly foreign policy. And so from our organization standpoint and from my perspective, we've been monitoring how many times a motion with regards to raising the pride flag would be contentious, what type of delegations would be coming, the type of vitriol they would be spewing and sharing in the name of protecting queer or youth or children in general, when in actuality it was causing further harm and taking away their agency, which is the other thing that we are really proud of in our work, is giving young queer and trans folks that agency. And so we're seeing education being attacked. We're seeing the long game of the far right. And I'm telling you folks, they play the long game. They are patient, and we're seeing it work. We're also seeing old school language around grooming and pedophilia, stuff we saw in the 50s and 60s, come unearthed. And I think if there's anything about this moment in hate that we're experiencing, is that we should never forget our history. And history would have told us that we were going to deal with something like this. And I think what history can also tell us is that when we are in solidarity with each other, and I mean across movements, when we are dedicated to addressing these issues collectively, we will be able to fight back. And I think that is like the lesson and the message I want to get across. Thank you for letting me ramble.
No, such a powerful ramble. Like, it wasn't a ramble. I mean, I ramble all the time, so I don't say that in a bad way, but such a powerful way of speaking to what's going on. And I think there were few things I wrote down, and like maybe we don't go too far into it, but I just want to make sure that when people rewatch this later, that there's like language that we are like is super accessible to folks. So when we say things like changing policy in our education system and doing all of that, I feel like the word that most people might feel like is the most connected to that, weirdly, is critical race theory, because it's become the term that is very like USA based, but like that is kind of like critical theory is what is and has been happening in Canada longer than we have heard of that term as an American thing. And I think because it's not called the same thing here, or it's not referenced that as like openly maybe, do either one of you want to speak to that? Because I think it sounds like this like even fight, like that's how it's often painted, is like the right and the left and they're equal, and like which side financially do you align with? But that's not the fight that this is. Yeah. We're talking about fundamental human rights as a concept, and the left best aligns with that. They don't perfectly align with that, but they best align with it. And then you have a side that's like not doing that. Like I don't know how to politely be like, they fucking suck, but they do.
But I think that's part of it, right? So I think we often, I've been saying a lot lately, like we have a stereotype of like the bigot, the homophobe is going to be your like great grandparent who's in his 80s, who's like just not with the times. And so we do a disservice to the strategy behind rising hate and rising conspiracy. So if we like trace evolutions of events, I think we started to see attacks on critical race theory, quote unquote, in the US early on, like before COVID. And that was very much lingo around like kids should not be learning about power and privilege. Kids should not be learning about realities of racism and colonialism in the world around us. And then that shifted to COVID conspiracies, and that then shifted to a fixation on queer and trans people. And they're still like zeroed in on each of those topics, but a lot of it really is about controlling what kind of education and autonomy young people have. It's efforts that, you know, if you don't teach people about racism, you're going to perpetuate racism in schools. If you don't teach people about homophobia, we're going to see more homophobia in schools. And so a lot of this is, it's not like an anomaly. The far right is not just like, oh, deciding to go this way and then that way. They bring strategy to it, and it is all about recruiting people into a broader pipeline of conspiracy. They radicalized a ton of people through COVID-19 misinformation, and they're now zeroing that audience and that group into anti-trans and anti-queer hate. And they're creating narratives that are hard for us to challenge. You know, when you hear protecting kids, everyone's instinct is, oh yes, we need to protect kids. That is the right thing to do, undoubtedly. But they lose the nuance. And so they frame queer and trans inclusion as a threat to children, as a threat to the parental rights. Queer and trans parents deserve to not have their kids bullied in schools. Queer and trans kids deserve to not be victimized and called slurs in the classroom. And so they reframe in a way that is quite insidious and that is intended to recruit somebody into this belief that the government is lying to you, that queer and trans people are insidious and behind the screens pulling strings, and that is also rooted in anti-Semitism, because they're alleging that a lot of queer and trans advocacy is funded by Jewish organizations. And so there isn't a like single issue here. It is an interwoven response that is trying to take conversations about power and privilege and shove them aside, which in turn re-entrenches that very power and privilege.
Jesus, there's just so much work to be done. It's so exhausting. And I can't imagine what it's like to see it every day. I feel like I saw a fraction of it when Fae was like gorgeously in the Hershey's ads. And the degree of hate that was there was awful. And all I could keep thinking is that for this many people to have this opinion about someone they do not know, and clearly an issue they don't understand, who has been speaking to them so directly and for so long to do that? Because I think that if you really sat down with most people and you explained the human rights angle and you helped them rip apart and remove the pieces of it of that the right kind of like creates around this like hate rhetoric and this like, you know, like the protect your kids, I'm like, yeah, sure, that sounds great. Like no one's disagreeing with protecting children. That's what the left and like human rights activists are trying to do. But I feel like for the vast amount of people, it's just like they got swept up in something. It's not an excuse. It's just like there's no counter narrative to that is as consistently being delivered in the way that the far right seems to be like playing some like Queen's Gambit level chess, while it feels like the left-leaning politics is like playing Connect Four.
Like, and maybe I'll throw it to you in a second, Debbie, but I think like the two things that I want to emphasize is, yeah, like I think like queer and trans folks, I feel like we're living in our own little corner where we're responding with every tool and strategy that we have. And I am waiting for the broader left to tap into this fight. I am wondering, like, it is isolated into an anomaly when it is the hot topic of the far right now. And most progressive organizations, media, institutions, politicians, their response is like, here's a pride picture, or here's a statement about how hate is bad. They're not recognizing that this is a fight for the principles that we are meant to stand behind as a movement and as a left. And then the other piece is that they're leaning into latent homophobia, transphobia, colonialism, and racism. And so they're really trying, like there's this, homophobia and transphobia didn't go away when we passed marriage equality. So those are still ingrained in our society. And many people still grow up and, are taught that gay people are bad or different or dangerous. And so they're leveraging like latent discrimination, using these narratives that instill anxiety and fear, and connecting those pieces together encourages people to show up at these protests. And so they're connecting these narratives in a way that shouldn't really surprise us, but that is dangerous and very strategic in nature.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's so good. I'm just like, there's like so many things there that I kind of wanted to touch on, and kind of bringing it back to the human rights piece. And again, my friends over at Action Canada are really good at talking about this because they draw the linkages around what we saw with Roe versus Wade. We recently had the 1-year anniversary of its repeal, and abortion rights, and connecting that to LGBTQ rights, broadly speaking, but trans-affirming care. And what we are seeing in terms of a reversion of like human rights is human rights are in complete opposition to authoritarianism, power, and control. So what these folks are doing, using anti-trans rhetoric, which is directly tied to white supremacy. All of it is directly tied to white supremacy. That's actually the thing I wanted to say. All these people are finding common cause with each other. That is what we're seeing. We are seeing the boiling point of that common cause coming together. Because who in their right mind thought incels and trans exclusionary radical feminists would be besties? But that's where we're at right now. And that's because they have common cause, and part of that common cause is maintaining a particular form of intersecting power that sees white supremacy at the top. And of course, it's patriarchal. It is, of course, authoritarian. And any control of your reproductive rights is in complete contravening to white supremacy, because white babies need to be born, folks. And that is why you'll see part of the language around the forced sterilization language that they'll talk about, how gender-affirming care is sterilization. And it's specifically language that they talk about white people accessing that. They won't say it out loud because it's never said out loud. And it's the same reason why abortion access is something they want to seek to restrict. They don't care if I get an abortion. But white cisgender women, absolutely. And this comes part and parcel of the things that we don't hear because they want to maintain that. Same thing where I talk about this from a co-conspirator perspective or an ally or however, is I try to say this message to Black cisgender women. Finding common cause with TERFs is not going to work for us, because from the construction of race itself, Black womanhood exists outside of white womanhoodness. It has always been positioned in proximity to masculinity. And so part of the transphobic rhetoric we see is weaponized against cisgender Black women. And that's because the womanhood that they are trying to aspire to, that is part and parcel of the gender binary that's been taught to us through colonization, the slave trade, etc., it's a white Judeo-Christian gender binary. And so that's the piece that I think is really important, which goes to my message to the right, like to the left. We need to do a better job at finding common cause with each other, because what's happening right now is that the far right is finding unlikely, people that we didn't think they would be friends with. They're finding common cause with the folks whose causes we have been at the forefront of supporting now. And this has come out very recently, where people are concerned that newcomer communities are in their own legitimate frustration, are only being heard by the far right. Mm-hmm. As a child of immigrants who comes from a religious family, we need to figure out, and this is a message for white LGBTQ people, what lessons in solidarity you folks need to do, and what lessons that you could be learning from those of us who aren't just queer and trans. We're queer and trans and many other things. We're also impacted by multiple forms of systemic oppression. And of course, our power and privilege is contextual based on the spaces that we exist in, central tenets of intersectionality. That is something, and I think that is a concern I have when it comes to what the left is doing, is we need to do a better job at finding common cause with each other, because they're doing a great job at it. And we're in for an uphill battle if we aren't utilizing our skill sets, our ability to build collectively to address this hate outside of using the federal government, provincial governments, or municipal governments. Like, it starts with the power, like the people power side, and 100%. That's kind of like, that's where I'm coming from.
No, I think that's, and I just want to, oh my God, I wrote so many things that if anyone else read this paper, they'd be so confused. But I just want to, can we just slow down for a quick second? And
sorry.
No, that's not. I just want to go back to what you said about incels and TERFs.
Yeah.
Can you just tell us clearly what an incel is for anyone who's a little confused, and what a TERF is, and how that shouldn't come together based on what both of them believe? Like, that does not make sense. And yet they're besties now. They're like pen pals. They're like showing up to the mall together. So sorry, can we slow it down and just like really drive that home?
Absolutely. So incels, if I'm correct, is just it's a slang term for already like a slang phrase of involuntary celibate, involuntary celibate. So this is usually cisgender men who adhere to a particular type of like ideology or thought process that they are owed access to sex, access to women, and dating. And as a result of not being freely given that, because of the realities of maybe their own behavior, it's the misogynistic blame of women or feminism for not giving them what they believe is their right to access as men, which is access to women, their bodies, and their companionship, and also their sexual and reproductive labor. On the flip side, TERFs, which is another slang term for trans exclusionary radical feminists, it speaks to a particular type of ideology. So I won't name it as a feminism. I'll just say it speaks to a particular ideology where there is a specific criticism of the patriarchy that is so radical enough that it believes that every issue associated with women's subordination is tied to men, but it goes as far as saying that men equals what you are assigned with at birth. And it goes further into these very complicated myths or complicated thoughts that people who were assigned male at birth, who transition at whatever stage of their life, that they are not women by virtue of what they weren't assigned at birth, but actually even further to say that they are doing cosplay or using this as a way to infiltrate the spaces that are supposed to be safe to cisgender women by virtue of what they believe are sex-based discrimination, not necessarily gender-based discrimination. And so you would think by virtue of feminism or an idea of feminism and misogyny, that would create a friction between these two thought processes. But what we're seeing is a common cause, which we're feeling and seeing really right now, which is this rise in anti-trans hate that both of these groups of people find common cause in. And Faye, is there anything that you want to add? Because I'm sure you're seeing this in a different perspective than I am, of course.
So I would say, yeah, I think everything that you said. I would add, I think incel has become a broad term that we use jokingly to refer to a lot of far right fascist men. And so it is I use it to describe all of the dudes who have feelings about feminism, and they're men's rights activists in all of the bad ways, but they're often like a group that is also engaged in like far-right conspiracy writ large. It's the like Andrew Tate fans. It is like, this is an idealized masculinity. It's Jordan Peterson fanboys and all of them. When it comes to TERFs, like I would have given more space to the like legitimacy of their feminism in like in an icky way. I'm going to contextualize that in a moment. In the 70s and 80s, like in the 70s and 80s, like TERFism like was an offshoot of feminism that was based on a perception of trans womanhood as a threat. It argued itself as being more like radical, and it was based in, it was meant to be based in like a material analysis of gender and patriarchy. The funniest thing about that is that every metric that you have shows that like if you hold every other factor solid, trans women experience higher rates of income inequality, hate and harassment, homelessness, poverty, et cetera, compared to cisgender women. But what has happened in the last 8 years or so is that, those TERFs were bad and icky, but they've lost even their like thin veil of feminism in 2020, 2023. So what we've seen emerge is what we call gender criticals, which are a new brand that has like allegiance to some extent to TERFs from way back when, but is largely groups of white, cisgender, privileged women who were often not actually feminists at all, who use this lingo to push a narrative where trans and gender diverse people are a threat to women's rights. But when they say women's rights in this context, they're not talking about feminism and women's rights as an actual concept. They're talking about a like utopic past idea of what womanhood was. You cannot be a gender critical without re-enchanting gender norms that are hostile to anybody who's not a middle-class, wealthy, cisgender white woman. And so the place that worries me is that there are these alliances between gender criticals and the far right. And it means that for the first time in a long while, the far right can use language of we're here to protect women and actually have, social conservative women coming in to defend and back them up. And that takes our ability to respond, because we are movements grounded in feminism. Social justice movements have a whole lot of women in them, but it turns it against us. And again, it plays into this narrative, protect not only children, but protect women and girls. And that allows the far right to use that as a recruiting tactic and to use that to bring predominantly, again, white, cisgender, middle-class women into this continuum of radicalization where they turn into pro-lifers, where they turn into COVID conspiracy theorists. When we look at the gender critical movement in Canada, they spend most of their time being a smokescreen for Jordan Peterson and far-right extremists. When I talk about the kind of hate that I receive for being a visible trans lady in media, they literally say, oh no, you're just mad at women who disagree with you. And I just have to take a step back because I'm like, it's not women predominantly who are sending slurs into my inbox and hate into my messages. It is fascists, that is far-right incel men, and these TERFs, these gender criticals, pretend that it's them so that they can frame it as trans ladies are being unreasonable and we're lying about everything and we actually don't like women, when what we actually see is like ongoing attacks against trans people from fascist and white supremacist organizations.
My face is going to do one of two things. I'm either going to start laughing or I'm going to get real angry. And I just want to preface that for the two of you and anyone watching. That's my trauma response is either to start laughing or to get like shut down completely. So I just want to preface that because I could feel one of the two emerging from my body. Okay, so we're talking about how, my God, there is so much uniting the right that shouldn't be possible, but it is, because people are trying to claw at their piece of power rather than ensuring that we all have access to just like basic human rights, dignity, respect. Like we're not asking for fucking succession level money here. We're just looking for like, can it be safe to go outside? Can it be safe to do it's, and what I've always heard about the left, which has always made me laugh, is that the left can't agree on anything. But I'm confused about this because why is it so hard for the left to understand what we're talking about is an intersectional fight for human rights. And that means people within the left also have work to do. Like, I have work to do in my journey to be more of an ally with the queer and trans community and the Black community and the Indigenous community, with migrants, with disabled people. Like, I have work to do as someone who runs On Canada Project. Like, I know that I'm on that journey, and also I have to show up for the fight, because like, it's no point being on the journey and like missing the whole thing. But there's like something that stops people from, particularly white people, from like recognizing that they can be on the right side of climate change and still not be far enough along in their fight for human rights and like equality. And I don't know what to say to them. And I feel like, I was wondering if either one of you had thoughts around that, because if we need to unite on the left, like, we can't unite around good enough, as good enough has not worked. Like, we tried it. You said good enough, and like, you as the two of you were involved in this, but they said good enough and they passed Roe v. Wade, for example, in the States. Black and Indigenous and low income people were like, we don't have access. It's still not working. This is not fair. Nobody listened. They could have solidified it. They could have made it better. They could have strengthened it, but they ignored the good enough of it all. And as a result, the right was able to swoop in and be like, it wasn't cemented enough, let me tear it to pieces. And now that human right is gone in the States. And let's not pretend we don't have the same thing here. It's just people get touchy if I use Canadian examples, so I won't. But we have those same issues here, and we keep settling for good enough rather than absolutely not. If it's not all of us, you're not doing your job.
Mm-hmm. Oof. So one of my favorite podcasts is Sandy and Nora Talk Politics. And it's my favorite. It's funny. I always like to say that Nora Loretto's dad was my high school librarian, and he's probably in part responsible for why I am the way I am. And I think what I really enjoy about the conversations they have around what's going on with the left in Canada is they say it for what it is. We are dealing with a neoliberal crisis on the left. And I'll name it as someone who works for a nonprofit. We do a lot of nonprofitization around our strategy to handling these things. And I think we need to take a step back and realize nonprofits maybe aren't the best positions to figure out these complex issues. They play a role, but they're probably not the ones at the forefront of this. Attached to that as well is we have a hesitancy of debating. I think we hear the term debate and we think Pierre Poilievre campus conservatives and we retreat. But no, even within the left, we need to debate ideas, because that's how we get good tactics to address things. So have we even presented the opportunity for a good debate on how are we going to address the far right and its attacks on LGBTQ people? Probably not, because if we did, we would have had solutions already and we'd be on the streets right now. It's the debate part. It's the how are we going to deal with this, looking at it from a people mobilization piece to a policy intervention piece, etc. So these two things are happening. We've, by virtue of design, we fractured our movements. That's just happened with the nonprofit industrial complex. And so we need to name the work of people who are at the front lines, who are surviving this violence, and probably taking leadership and direction from them. But on the flip side, are we actually having meaningful debate on developing tactics to address the issues we're facing? I don't think so. This is a great example of it. We're starting this. This is great. But Fae and I are in alignment with a lot of approaches. What would it look like for there to be a conversation with other leftists where we're like, actually, I think your approach to addressing this is absolute shit. Here's what my thoughts are. We don't do that because we think that conflict is violence, or we think conflict is a bad thing. Mm-hmm. We need to see that opportunity for conflict and debate as a necessary part of social movement building, because guess what? The other side is doing it, and they are mobilizing, and they don't need nonprofits to get this shit handled. Trust me, both Fae and I live in Ottawa, and we saw how quickly money funneled. into what was a grassroots mobilization and occupation downtown, they did not need a nonprofit to do that. It is scary, and what they did had a lasting effect on people in Ottawa. I know this very intimately through some of the work I've been doing looking back at the impact of the convoy, but those are the things that I'm talking about, is like, how can we, even within the left, challenge the status quo for us to have the tactics we need to address this in a meaning and authentic way.
I love all of that, and I feel like that could be its own like 13-hour conversation around like the messy and like the fuckery that is the nonprofit world. If I can jump in, like a few things that I'm thinking about are in terms of that like root question, like why are we so divided? I think it's because we care about the end goal with a greater specificity than I think a lot of the far right does. They are happy to be a big tent, and they're happy to have everyone like jump from issue to issue to issue, and they don't all need to be on the same page because they have this broader narrative that is like often utopic, and this idea of we need to go back to how we were, and that is again about retaining or rebuilding control. Whereas on the left, I think we have this idea of like we need to be the best, and we need to have our solutions be the best, but there's also infighting that comes with that, and we aren't good at navigating how we get along. We aren't always like 110% in alignment on everything. I like to think of myself as quite far on the left, but I'm also like a pragmatist, right? Like I want us to bring together and find solutions that will drag us all along in the right direction. But I don't always know what that direction is going to be. I know it has to be grounded in our values, and I know it has to be intersectional. I know it has to be a world that's radically different from this one. But we're not always good at having that conversation. Like, how do we work together when we don't always have the exact same approach or lens to our issues? And then there is like the nightmare that is both liberalism and neoliberalism. We had whole movements that used like mainstream versions of those movements that was based off the idea of like, we need legislation change A, B, and C. And that legislation change is a good thing. It is, I think of it as harm reduction. Like the gays being able to get married is a huge win. Us being able to have human rights protections, huge win. But the issue is that became what the whole fight was about. It wasn't about improving the material realities of whole communities. It wasn't about uplifting or like revoking structures and systems of violence and oppression that are all over our society. It was that we need this one change in policy. And I think I would agree with Debbie in particular, like nonprofits are not going to be the solution here because the right is more organized and they're also better at the public opinion things. They don't have to care about what government's going to take away their money. Their money is coming from rich white folks who are well-resourced and living in the private sector. Whereas we, as a movement, are often overly dependent on government dollars, which does curtail how we're able to approach and respond to crises. It is harder for us to say, you know, screw this government, because that government is also funding us. And that funding is good. So I'm not criticizing it. We need government money. But we often reimagine that as the objective rather than a means to the end. I think of nonprofits, I don't owe my fealty to any organization. I owe my fealty to causes and movements. And we need to come back to that as the goal that we're working towards. Nonprofits are not going to save the world, but we can use them to pull the world along while recognizing that they're not the silver bullet and that there are a fuck ton of flaws built into how they operate because they too are a reflection of power and privilege.
Also, like people working in nonprofits are not paid what they should be paid. They're not given the benefits. They're not guaranteed any of that shit, and they're addressing policy gaps, like by and large. So the fact that that's who we're asking, like, it's like if we were like, not that we're going to like war, but like it's like an army with no resources, no nothing, up against an army who has like every tech and every like afforded to them.
Like how do we navigate when they're both part of the problem and part of the solution to the problem? Like that is the really messy part, because they are reflecting everything that is wrong with our world. But on the flip side, they are also meeting basic needs that we struggle, that we don't have community infrastructure to scale. And we're starting to change as mutual aid and other stuff is starting to change this and has for generations and decades. But like, they're a Band-Aid solution while being part of the problem, while not being resourced to really address the problem. Sorry.
No, I think this is such an important conversation. I want to, my gosh, I want to talk about literally everything. I want to talk about Hampton and the Rainbow Coalition. I want to talk about rising hate. I want to talk about radicalization of young white boys. There's so many things that are coming up for me. Luckily, this is just episode 1. But what comes next, I guess? What is something that everyday people can commit to right now in their own lives, in the communities that they're a part of, and in how they engage with their elected officials, with the caveat being like, we need to make it easier to engage with our elected officials, and the people don't do that enough. And part of that is that you're busy worrying about making rent and figuring out how to pay for health insurance out of pocket, or health stuff out of pocket, et cetera, et cetera. Like, life is really hard for the working middle class, more so when you add in the intersections of identities. And also, like, this flawed democratic system is our only system to try to enact the change that we want to see. So what is that, like, duty of care and responsibility that we have to each other? And maybe we'll start with, like, the role that we have as individuals to start with.
I can start. So this could be applied to individuals, but it could also be applied to grassroots organizations. It could be applied to nonprofit organizations. I think public education is going to be extremely crucial. And by public education, I mean really doing the work to address what is currently happening right now that we're seeing in the far right, especially when it comes to addressing trans folks in communities, where over the last couple of years, you know, there's a rise of visibility and trans representation in media, which some people might name as like awesome, like trans joy examples. But we still are dealing with a very wide-scale misunderstanding of transness, trans people, etc. What happens is the far right exploits the middle. They exploit the visibility and the ignorance that continues to exist in society. So from a public education piece, I think there's a responsibility we have to equipping people like my parents with the important knowledge of who their community members are, who may be trans and gender diverse, and beating them to it, because the other side is doing a good job at simplifying falsely understandings of people in community that just continues to perpetuate these harmful myths, that is slowly chipping away at what was a broader understanding and acceptance of LGBTQ people broadly, to now seeing more cisgender heterosexual people dividing LGBTQ people, being like, I'm okay with these, the LGBs.
Yeah.
But these folks over here, no, because I heard X, Y, and Z. So from a public education piece, right? Like, is there something that you can dispel around, you know, what it is, being transgender, what is gender affirming care, the basics, and in a way that you can simplify it for my parents who, even being in this country for almost 40 years, still are learning, as opposed to what they are getting, which is this group of people wants to cause harm to young people, because that message is resonating. So what are we doing from a public education piece? And that also going to mean talking to people we don't want to talk to. This might be your family members who are bigots. This might be your neighbor who you're not familiar with. This might be that conservative MP who happens to be the MP of your riding. Can you have this conversation with them from a public education piece? It's going to require being uncomfortable with being comfortable with being uncomfortable, but it's a necessary thing to happen in order for us to shift public opinion, which ultimately shifts public policy.
And then you can also, Faye, if you want to go, you can totally go. I was going to give my hot take on like what I think people can do. But
I mean, like, I think I love chatting on panel or on convos with Debbie, because it's just like everything that she said. But I think we default to like, you're a bigot in context where I wouldn't actually go that route. Like, I will scream at homophobes and transphobes and bigots on socials. If I'm at a protest, I will ramble at them. But it is like we don't live in the like echo chamber that the far right likes to describe the gays as living in. However, we are not used to talking to people who don't have a background in social justice. We're not used to talking to people who don't know all of the language. Like I would never go on TV and say like, we need to end cis heterosexism, because that's gonna make a bunch of folks disconnect the moment I say that. I talk about how all children and young people deserve to learn about themselves, a complicated world, and to be supported in their communities. And so reframing and learning how to reach people who aren't already on our side, because we're not good at that. And as Debbie said, the far right is really great at simple messages that are value-based that will turn you against marginalized groups and segment us off from each other. So in terms of what you can do, be the person who shows up at counter rallies against protest targeting drag events and other queer spaces. Talk to your family, talk to your friends, bring them on board with you. Support organizations like the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity and local queer and trans organizations, particularly those that serve folks at the intersection of multiple identities. One of the things that we have screwed up is we've created, and I'm like guilty of this myself as like the white middle class trans lady who has a platform. I am not the right person to send into every conversation because I am a white middle class lady from a military family. And so we need to be uplifting the folks who are living in poverty, who are disabled, who are Black, Indigenous, and racialized. Like we need to reframe how we do leadership and whose cue are we taking, because it really does, it allows the far right to play into narratives that create division when they imagine our movements as looking like the most privileged in those movements. They can then pit everyone else against each other.
And then I'll add to this, and then maybe we'll combine community and like political things together so we can wrap before 4, as well as anything else anyone else wants to add. The last 3 years of running OCP has been a whirlwind. I think it's pushed me to be more of an ally, more of someone who's in solidarity in a way that my privilege prevented me from doing so in a multitude of ways, not just with the queer and trans community, but with Indigenous and Black people, with migrants, despite being the child of immigrants. Like it's like it has required so much more of me, but also like it has shown me that evolution of understanding can happen really quickly if you subscribe into it, and that you don't have to be an expert. Like I can't list off all the things you guys have been talking about today, but I can deeply like understand that like that's not okay. Like I couldn't give you the definition of all of the terms that we've used today around the trans community, right? Like I wouldn't know how to give that, but I do know that their human rights matter. And I feel like it sounds silly almost to be like simplify it down to like the base, look up what human rights are actually and be like, do you think that people should have this upheld? Because when you look at that list, it like, how dare anyone say anything to counter that? It just like, I think that there's like a basic common sense denominator here of like, do you just want people to be treated well? And that's not enough. Like you, with that understanding, you must show up, you must do the advocacy work, you must do all of the next steps. But some pieces, depending on what your life is like, you're not going to be able to do a deep dive and fact check and like blah, blah, all these pieces. You're just going to have to understand that human rights matter, and you're going to have to find leaders and activists that you trust that fight the good fight to like be like, when Debbie says something on Twitter, I'm like, that's probably right. I mean, like if she told me Succession was a bad show, I would be disappointed in her, but like I would I find people that you trust that you're like, this is cool, I'm going to follow what they're saying and make sure those people don't look like you. Like find diverse voices and then just stay engaged in that information. It can be this super involved process, and we need to all get to that point, but you can start with something as easy as just being like, yeah, people's human rights matter. So going forward, when someone says something transphobic, I'm just going to say, that's kind of messed up. You need to check yourself. Transphobia is not okay ever. And just like say that. And I feel like that action snowballs people a bit to get that next step and get that next step of understanding and community support. Just like wherever you are, start, and then just keep walking forward in your allyship. And then maybe I'll go back to Debbie and then to Fae on what comes next in our community settings, whether that's work, whether that's in grassroots spaces, schools, etc., and in relationship to government policy and stuff as well.
Absolutely. So what to do next in our communities? I think we definitely just need to acknowledge and reckon what's actually happening. And that it's a scary time for many people. I think ignoring it is part of the problem. And I think folks like Fae and myself have been kind of sharing this message through public platforms, trying to get the message across to decision makers. I think this is an urgent issue. There's this feeling that I think our community members have that we're not being heard, and that's disheartening, because if we as a community are feeling this most. Oh, can you hear me?
Now it's better, but you like had this
okay. Oh no, can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, please let me know if it happens again. So I was just saying that there needs to be an acknowledgement that there is a problem here, and that's
it's happening again, Debbie. Sorry.
It's also the exact same point it happened last time.
I know, right?
No. You go ahead, Faye.
Okay. Sorry, Debbie.
Sorry, Debbie.
It's not.
So I think like maybe I'll stress, Debbie and I tend to speak to a similar thing here, which is like we need to wake up, and there is an urgent need here. Like we need to take the attacks on queer and trans communities as an isolated thing, but not as an isolated thing. We need to take them and recognize that it is the latest prong of a multi-pronged attack on the very humanity, dignity, and human rights of marginalized communities. We need to recognize that the far right isn't going anywhere, that they're well-resourced, they're organized, and they are coming for all of us. I also think we need to recognize that engaging, that we do not need to be perfect to be able to do this work in a good way. We cannot expect perfection of ourselves, but we can recognize that engaging with broken systems, when we know the goal is to fundamentally reimagine those systems, is harm reduction through and through. I am in a context where I'm spending every day trying to make sure that our little baby gay orgs still have money to keep serving their young people who are walking through the front door. And that does mean advocating for more government money. And that does mean you got to work in some interesting ways. But as long as the end goal is one there where we reimagine that world and where everyone has that foundation of justice, equity, basic needs, and a world where these structures are not the way that they are today, we can be in this together. And again, we need to raise the bar. We have stopped dreaming on the left, I find. We have stopped imagining what kind of world do we deserve to live in, and we've allowed neoliberalism to steal our radicalism and to steal our imagination of a world where we don't have to be fighting these fights, where people can live together, again, with that respect for dignity, human rights, and justice for all. That's not rocket science, but if we come back to that and we can help people understand that the far right is trying, with all of their diverse tactics, to take away the respect for inherent human dignity and respect and human rights, that is a point of common interest that the left can rally around, and that we can bring the public along with us, because that is a shared value and it is a sexy one.
I don't trust my internet, so I'm just going to leave it at that.
I mean, that came across super clear, but I'm sure the moment
See?
the internet's homophobic.
Exactly.
Instagram
During Pride
like us for saying what we've said.
During Pride Month.
I think this is a beautiful place to maybe start wrapping this up, just because you guys have been so generous with your time. Debbie, please come back forever and ever and ever. Like, if you're like, this is such a great conversation, and there's still one more seat here. Right now it's Baby Yoda, but like it could be somebody else. So let's keep bringing folks into this conversation, and let's keep it going until everyone's liberated and we are all in this like world that I guess we've yet to imagine, to take from what Faye was saying. And please show up for your local communities. There's a lot of effed up shit happening in Durham, Ontario right now with their Catholic school board.
And in Calgary, and in New Brunswick, and in Ottawa tomorrow, and in every single damn community. That's
in every community. Absolutely. And it's like, if you haven't heard of it, it's because the media landscape in this country is abysmal, and it's not, you're just not, it's happening. So that is something that I feel like what we say in OCP is, if it's happening in America and you've heard about it, it's probably happening here too. It's just not reported on that much. So, and the podcast was Sandy and Nora Talk Politics. I was just going to add. Nora also has a really great book called Take Back the Fight that is the reason why OCP is not a nonprofit. I was like, that makes sense, Nora. Thank you, stranger. Like,
Funny, I have that book in my backpack right now.
Really? It's my emotional safety book. I like carried that and Audre Lorde collected essays around everywhere with me in hopes that they'll heal my soul. So thank you to the two of you for being here, and everybody else, please tune in next month for the next episode of The Queer Agenda. If you are someone with loads of money, feel free to sponsor this so that we can put some money towards getting this up on the internet faster, and to give honorariums to people like Debbie and Fae and anyone else who's coming into the space, so that people are paid for their labor and their time and their energy. Social justice work is expensive too. But yeah, holler at if you're rolling in money.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys. We'll see you next month.
Bye.